Today, I am going to uncover, expose, and reveal how Internet Shaquille makes his YouTube videos. And I should know, because I'm him. A little bit of background before we begin, just in case you don't know who I am. I have a YouTube channel that has 500,000 subscribers. There's your social proof. I went to school for design, got a master's with a focus on instructional design. Worked for 5 years at a public university setting where I was an instructional designer, and then left there and moved to a private construction company to do instructional video-based design for 4 years. And I want to talk about design. I've kind of painted myself into a food corner on my main channel, and something that I hear a lot is, I wish more people knew how to make videos in the specific way that you do. And I've written down a bunch of notes in my phone. This isn't really a script. This is just a bunch of notes that I've written out for about 3 years. And these notes have just been languishing in my phone for that long, waiting to be formatted into, I don't know, an audiobook, a very long video, a paid course. But I realized it's not doing anybody any good being on my phone. And so I thought, as a rough attempt at putting this information out there, I'll just read these notes, talk about the top level ideas behind them, and hopefully help a couple people who are interested in teaching online with video. And I know that there are people who certainly could use this information, because throughout all of the hobbies that I've collected, I know for certain there is room in this world for a NetShack style video production on interior design. Nobody talks about interior design for normal humans and simplifies it in a way that teaches them how to make a beautiful home. The same goes for DJing. I picked up DJing, and a lot of this information is just how to do house transitions, and it doesn't really have a set beginning, middle, and end for what a beginner should pay attention to versus a professional or wannabe professional. And the same goes for cameras. It took me a long time to figure out how to shoot anything other than full auto on the camera. And I think part of that is just because anybody who knows anything about cameras, once you learn that much and you find out what an aperture is and f-stop and exposure and shutter speed, you don't really remember how to talk about that beginner level stuff as if you were a beginner. And so there is room in this world for more people to sort of take this format and apply it to any number of topics. At the top of these notes is a list called biases, because I realized I'm a heavily biased person. A lot of this stuff is not going to be how to be successful on YouTube or how to have a really popular course online, because I think there's enough information out there regarding how to do that, how to chase the algorithms and such. And so this is more of like a Seth Godin head's perspective, and not so much a Gary V hustle head, rise and grind culture type of video. I think that a lot of attention is paid on gaining notoriety, and this is more so focused on applying generosity. And that's the word that I use the most when I talk about this sort of stuff. And I wish it wasn't, because it sounds like I'm canonizing myself, like I'm this huge saint for making 5-minute long YouTube videos. But generosity really is the only way I've found to frame this sort of stuff. Like this video that I'm making right now isn't entirely very generous. I'm just sitting here in front of a green screen. I'm going to send this off to an editor to take care of. If I was being really generous, I would have turned it into a course or a book, given it away for free, done the hard work of formatting all this stuff into something that's more digestible and applies to more people. But you get what you get in this case. And I think the more generous you can be, the more successful you stand to be as well. I think it's a direct correlation if you want it to be. And I think the way that I see it is, the example that I like to give is, if you see somebody doing something cool and you say, oh, that looks easy, I could do that. That's not a very generous interpretation of the cool thing that you saw. However, if you said, that looks cool, that looks rewarding, I should try that, I think that's somebody who's more likely to produce work in a generous way. And I say produce work. I want to get this out there now. This is not about how to make content. I think the idea of content as a meme word proliferated in a way that doesn't really matter anymore. But content was always a word for like Procter and Gamble to populate their Instagram. Like, you should not aim to make content. You should aim to make work that matters for people who care. There's my first of what will probably be many Seth Godin references. I think that once you start to see your work, as a body of work, you're less likely to write it off as just content. And I think that's probably a good thing. Back to generosity, I saw this video one time, it was probably 15 minutes long, where a guy experimented with making a bunch of different whipped creams and using a bunch of different stabilizing techniques and extra ingredients to show which stabilized whipped cream stays whipped the longest. That is a very generous act to do all of that work in the hopes of helping people make the most long-lasting whipped cream. So that's what I mean about generosity. And the second note here is, why is video good? Especially in the public university setting, I had to go to a lot of talks and put together a lot of presentations to say video is good. So I won't spend too much time on this because I think you probably already think video is good because you're watching a very long one. But a lot of the more curmudgeonly teachers, instructors, professors saw video as the TV or the TikTok, and they don't really want to subject their class material to something that's so easily digestible. But video is very good for a lot of technical reasons. First of all, you don't even need to perform it yourself. You don't even need to appear on camera. You could just put stock footage above everything you say or reference what you're talking about with images. You don't even have to be the narrator. You could just write it all out and hire a, hopefully not text-to-speech, maybe somebody on Fiverr to read it for you. But video saves the learner's time. It makes things go by more quickly than just reading. Plus, you can add layers of information. So I was watching this font video by Linus Bowman all about fonts. And when a new font that the narrator was talking about came onto screen, it would show textually next to the font who made it, when it was made, a couple details about it, so that the narrator could just keep talking instead of saying, and now we're going to talk about Frutiger, which was designed in whatever year by whatever guy. You can just keep going. You can layer information, so you don't always have to be showing exactly what you're saying. I think that when people first start making video, they want to show exactly what they're saying all the time, and that ends up making their end results a lot longer when they don't need to be. In video, you can skip over chapters that you already know. You can play it back at half speed if the person's talking too fast. You can play it at 2x speed if the person's talking too slow. You can rely on prerequisite knowledge. I was watching a Brian Lagerstrom video about how to cook a certain smoked beef sandwich, and 90% of the video is about how to smoke the beef. And at the end, he says, oh, and if you want to make your own buns, here's a video that I made about how to make your own buns. And it doesn't even have to be your own library that's being referenced. This stuff is living on a screen where you can reference a bunch of modular lessons, and you can say, all right, this was a video about how to make smoked beef, and if you want to make a sandwich, go over there, jump around. Unlike a book, if you wanted to build a textbook like that, it would have to be sort of a choose your own adventure textbook, which is not very fitting for the medium. So that's why it's good, but at the same time, I do think video is far too often the default medium. This came up a lot in the private sector. Once my bosses figured out that video is really good and I was doing a really good job at it and it was great at communicating big complex ideas, they wanted everything to become a video, because let's say there's a new pay structure being figured out and it's being dispersed to all the employees. Let's make a video about that. Or I have a big announcement. Let's make a video about that and give it to all the employees as a training. You really should be considering whether this needs to be a video at all. Could it be a PDF? Could it be a memo, an email, a blog post, a slide deck? Even this video that I'm recording now, it's really just me talking. There's not a whole lot of visuals that you need to absorb the information. So maybe this should be a podcast or an audiobook. I don't want to make one, so I didn't make it one, but you get the idea, hopefully. The next section here on my notes is most common mistakes when making video-based instruction. I think number one on that list every time is going to be not tying your instruction to learner outcomes. And if you're a professor, you already know what learner outcomes are. Otherwise, you might not be familiar with having a explicit outcome. You should be able to complete a sentence like, at the end of watching this video, students will be able to. You could also look into Bloom's taxonomy, B-L-O-O-M, Bloom's taxonomy. It's like a hierarchy of what a student will be able to do upon receiving this information that you give them. So you should be tying your work to some learner outcome other than they'll receive the information that I have to give. Another common mistake is not showing what you're doing. I was watching a YouTube video about how to install a window air conditioner, and the guy was recording it with his phone and had to put the phone down to use both hands to install the air conditioner. So I ended up learning virtually nothing because I couldn't actually see what was going on. This happens a lot more than you might think. Using different terms for the same thing. I did a lot of Excel training in the private company, and one problem that you run into a lot is people all call different parts of the programs different things. This is a sheet, or is it a tab? Do you click over to this sheet, or do you click over to this page? Do you click over to this tab? You got to call everything the same thing. And if you're recording somebody live, you don't really have that option, but hopefully you're writing scripts every time, so you can go through and read the script and make sure something's called the exact same thing every time if you're doing a technical training. And also, there's just a whole lot of wasted time in video. You don't have to make this like a textbook where the longer it is, the more prestigious it is. Just say what you need to say and move on. That is the end of the most common mistakes portion of these notes. So how do you actually get started in producing video-based instruction? Step one, every single time, is going to be identifying your learner. And you might say, if you're a YouTuber, well, my learner, my target demographic is everybody, anybody who's willing to listen. That's not going to work here. If you're in the private sector, you're going to say, oh, well, my learner is all of the employees, because this is a company-wide training and everybody has to take it no matter what. Try to be a little bit more specific here. Who is your learner? What are their fears? What are their biases? What are their goals? And so in the private sector, we had underground utility strike training. How do you avoid that? So their fears are something along the lines of, what happens if I do hit a utility? Am I going to get fired? Am I going to get fined? With students in the public sector, I always had this joke when I was working there that students are the only demographic that wants less for their money, because really they've already paid the fees to go to school and they hope to just pass and get a good grade. So they don't really have a whole lot of goals outside of that. But when you're in the YouTube space, it's really tempting to just say, well, my audience is everybody. But what ends up happening if you're like trying to hit as many people as possible is you have to adopt that Gary V, Mr. Beast, Darman aesthetic or mindset where you're dumbing down your information into super simple English so that it works on people who English isn't their first language or they can't read. You're using these like vibrant emotions and very universal symbols of saying like, this guy won the money, jump up and down, yay, ding, 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 things like that, I don't think really apply to the style that I hope that you're trying to achieve. So after you identify your learner, you really do have to identify what is it that they need to learn. And this is similar to your learning outcomes, but you've got to be realistic about what they're able to digest. I think in the cooking world, identifying what a student needs to learn can be difficult or maybe just overlooked, because there's always a bunch of little factoids coming at you like, okay, I'm going to put butter over this pan. You don't want to make the pan too hot or else the butter might foam up too fast, and in that case you'd have to take it off the heat. And by the way, I hope you're not using cast iron. Because you know so much, you end up layering all this information that doesn't necessarily need to be conveyed. So be honest and explicit about what the learner does need to learn before you finish writing your script, or maybe even start. What do you want to say and what tone should it carry? Tone is often overlooked. The tone of this video is very casual, partly because if you're watching it, I probably already have your enrollment, your buy-in, your interest. And so I don't need to start with a, hey guys, I'm gonna, whatever. So your tone might need to be a little bit more excitable if you're teaching young children, for example, or disinterested teens in something boring. So pay attention to what tone you need to adopt in order to get your learner a little bit more engaged. I know that one of my great successes in the private sector was carrying a tone that was more of like a, we're in this with you, and less of a, this is a message from your boss. And I think that if you can get successful at carrying and establishing a tone, that can take you really far. What is the prerequisite knowledge is the last one on this list. And a lot of times this can be difficult, especially if you're making a training for, say, a superintendent where you understand that they probably were a field engineer 5 years before, so you just assume that they know a bunch of stuff. But you really have to establish what is the prerequisite knowledge. So in a cooking example, I might say, okay, you need these 5 ingredients, and one of them is minced garlic. I'm not going to break away and say, in order to mince garlic, you go here, 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 then this way, then finally, in this example, I'm assuming that my audience is working at an intermediate level and can mince their own garlic. So I'm establishing that as prerequisite knowledge, and I don't need to spend a whole lot of time slowing down or going back and explaining how to mince garlic. And also just generally telling somebody that they have to mince garlic is a real ambition killer. So barreling through that really quickly, tone-wise, gets them to stay in that mindset of, oh, I really could make this. It's not going to be so difficult, compared to those TikTok quick cut videos where you show exactly every step that a person has to do, and 5 seconds in, you're like, okay, that's more effort than I'm willing to put into a recipe. I have a section in these notes called script critique, and I think that I was imagining this as a full-on instructional course where I'd be able to have people submit their scripts and I'd be able to critique them. This was a big portion of what I did in both jobs that I've had previously. And it's just one of those things that you can't talk about unless you have an example in front of you. And since I no longer have a full-time job, I can't just go back and steal some scripts that I wrote previously. But generally, I would say script-wise, first of all, you should be writing a script. Second of all, you should be editing it ruthlessly after it's done. Try to provide value to the viewer. You have to be honest about what the value that you're providing is. So I'm recording this in the middle of January. And so far, this week alone, I've seen 3 different YouTube thumbnails where the title is, "This recipe is going to change your life." And that doesn't really provide value to the viewer. Sure, maybe it will change their life, but likely this is just a lazy way of framing what kind of value you're providing. I think the best job I ever did at this, YouTube-wise, is making a video called "Why Are Restaurant Burritos Better Than Homemade?" And that's because it's providing value to the people who might be disappointed with the food that they make at home, might have misunderstandings about this idea of, well, you just add more butter and more salt to everything, and that's what makes restaurants good. And so being specific and being honest about what value your work provides is going to go a long way in terms of getting you started and getting you through the script writing process. You should criticize your beginning and your end of the script mercilessly. The beginning, obviously, you got to get your attention. The end, you really got to put a bow on things. I think when you're working as a professor, it's very easy to just end a lesson by, okay, class adjourned, that's it. But I think you have an opportunity here in the video space to make somebody crave more information or to put a bow on things in a way that they feel accomplished for finishing it. And so you should really pay, I would say, when I write a script, it takes, 50% of the time to write the actual material and maybe 40% of the time figuring out how it's going to end, because I want to end things in a way where you feel energized and glad about what you just learned and glad to have learned what you just learned. You should definitely be writing everything as a script, but you should also try to write it in your own natural voice. And we've been conditioned to write in a way that's very different from our natural voice, so this might take some getting used to. For example, you might not write "gonna" in a professional document. You would say "going to," but you want to write this in the way that you actually speak because you have to read it and you want it to come out naturally. And so, "I'm going to teach you about," doesn't sound very good. You should read through your script several times at your normal speaking volume, tone, pace, because it might take 5 read-throughs before you find a way to untangle something or find something that you realize doesn't even need to be there, or notice that you say a certain word several times in a row back to back and you don't really notice that until you hear it being read out loud. So definitely read everything that you write out loud before you even think about starting to record anything. In each read-through that you do, keep the learning outcome in mind and remove anything that doesn't contribute to that learning outcome. And I think this is a really important part. You need to be building and resolving tension. Knock, knock, who's there? Building, resolving. In the world of YouTube, I think people fail to realize that the thumbnail and the title build tension. And so by clicking on the video, they're hoping for a resolution to that tension, hopefully quickly. But most of the time, 10% or up to 30% of the video is spent on building up to the release of this tension. You don't need to do that. For example, if I make a video about how do you make hummus, the person who clicked on the video is already interested in that. So you can resolve that tension immediately. And that's why I get so many comments that are like 3 minutes in, or not even, like 45 seconds in, and this guy's already given us 3 different recipes for hummus. That's because you can resolve that tension from clicking on the thumbnail immediately and then build more tension on and resolve that later. You can be doing this sort of repartee. I don't know if that's the right word even. You can do this back and forth where it's like building tension and resolving it. So in the hummus example, I might say, oh, how do you make hummus? Here's 3 different ways. But what if you really like buying it? And then you're posing a argumentative point. You're sort of arguing against yourself. You're saying, well, what about the naysayers who just watched that and still aren't convinced? And so you can say, well, what about people who do want to buy hummus at the store? Well, to them, I say, you can make it even faster by doing this, this, and this. And maybe you can also freeze it so you always have it on hand. Or maybe you like the flavors of what they offer in the store, to which I say, just make a big gallon of plain hummus and then add sriracha or roasted onions or roasted garlic for each portion that you make. Something like that, where you're going back and forth, building up tension and resolving it. And so the hummus example is a way of building tension and resolving it with new ideas and counter arguments. But you can also build tension by just introducing a very big, weighty, complicated topic and then resolve it by untangling that topic or explaining it away. I saw a video that was titled, I think, How to Understand Music Theory in 15 Minutes or Less. That's a ton of tension, and he's slowly untangling it and resolving it by building upon fundamental knowledge until you pretty much understand music theory, and that's incredible. One more piece of advice for anybody writing a script is that the market is not listening as closely as you might think it is. Nobody cares about this topic as much as you do. For example, I saw a guy who sent me one of his early videos saying, hey, can you critique my work? He was also a cooking channel, and food media is notoriously difficult to shoot. You're in an environment that's not conducive to setting up a bunch of lights or framing with a 16:9 frame or getting good sound. But this guy was sending me a first draft of one of his videos, and one of the parts of his script was when he zoomed in on his midsection with a countertop showing what he was cooking, he said something like, oh, sorry, Babish, I stole your look. The market is not listening as closely as you think. Nobody is looking at a frame and saying, oh, he stole the Babish look. And I think it's important to keep in mind as you're writing this script that you're the person who likely knows the most about this topic, and so you don't need to be apologizing for things that you expect to be trite. Nobody is listening as closely as you think they are. It's for that same reason that I wouldn't ever go online and say something like, oh, hey guys, I didn't post all month because it's been Christmas break. Sorry about that. New videos will be back in January. The market isn't listening as closely as I might think. Nobody really cares. They've been out enjoying their holiday break. They're not sitting by wondering, where the heck is his new video for December 25th? I have a section on the notes here called Specifics for Formal Education, more of that private business or public education setting. First, proof of prerequisite knowledge via the LMS. You can prove prerequisite knowledge. You can say, hey, you have to complete this course. LMS is a learning management system, so if you're in a university setting, or I'm guessing most private training departments also use an LMS because they have to figure out what your grade is on all these tests, you can objectively prove what prerequisite knowledge a learner has. So if you've established what it is that they need, you can enforce that in the learning management system. I'm surprised I have to explain this tip for the formal education space, but you do not have to justify vying for learners' attention. In the public university setting, in the private setting, you'd get big bosses and professors and CEOs saying something like, well, they have to take this course, so I don't care if it's boring as hell. Stop trying to make it so flashy. I'll pay them for their time. They've got to learn it. This is a requirement. It is not frivolous. You have my permission to vie for the learner's attention. You'd be doing the generous thing by keeping them engaged. Also, not everything has to be in the video. If this is a more formal education setting, this is not YouTube where you have to fit everything into the actual video. You can reinforce information with PDFs in the course or with the actual test that comes after it. If you introduce something conceptually, you can test or give examples in the test that if they answer it correctly, they would understand not only one example of the theory or the concept, but also prove their understanding of that concept. There's probably no situation in which you're making all of the courses without subject matter expert help, because when I make videos about how to do accounting software, I have to go talk to the head accountant and ask them. But while you're talking to them, you have to ask disarming, honest, sometimes argumentative questions like, what do you say to people who might argue that this process might not need to be completed in this way? What do you say to people who think that this process is overly bureaucratic or hard to explain or not very effective? And that is the generous work of acting on behalf of your learners to ask the subject matter expert to consider those things, because otherwise they're in the same situation as you sometimes are when you're writing the script, which is they care the most about it. They're not really having these arguments in their head, and you need to be a representative for your learner asking these sorts of questions that at times can get a little uncomfortable, but most of the time do resolve in ways that are very helpful. So one time I did a course for HR about a new pay structure, and I asked them, is anybody's pay going to be any amount lower due to this change? And it took them about 3 days to definitively say yes, because they went through every single employee and made sure that nobody's pay would get lower. And that uncomfortable conversation that we had, oh man, what great value I was able to add to the course by saying, all right, part one, nobody's pay is going to get lower. That's resolving tension right away. And so something like that only happens if you have these uncomfortable conversations. That's enough of the formal education tips. These are specifics for YouTube. First of all, I have a bunch of personal beliefs. I'm not saying that you have to follow these. I'm just saying if you want to produce media the way that I do, some of these personal beliefs are what inform my choices. I think a lot of times my personal beliefs get me in trouble or put me in disadvantaged situations. For example, I don't have a catchphrase. There's not something that I say in every single video like, and don't forget, let's get cooking. And that takes money out of my pocket potentially because I'm not able to offer let's get cooking merchandise or t-shirts or aprons. So take that for what it's worth. These are all just personal beliefs and you should establish your own. For example, I don't think any video needs a title sequence where it's like, and we're going to get right into it after this. And so some cool graphics and music. I don't think you need a title sequence. Your video doesn't need 3 introductions. I have an entire playlist that I add every video that I find it's called Saying Hi Twice. You would be astonished at how many people say hi 4 times. They introduce their video 4 times before it even starts. And so 30% of their work is just introducing, is just working on that tension and not resolving it. Let me give you an example. Hey guys, what's up? Today I'm going to be talking about how to make videos. Saying hi once. Here comes the what's it called? Title sequence or cold open. That's number 2. Number 3, I come back and say, hey guys, welcome back. So like I said before, today we're going to be talking about, it's like, that's number 3. And by the way, 4 was before you even clicked when you looked at the video thumbnail and title and it says, today I'm going to be talking about how to make a video. That's introducing the topic 4 times before you get to it. I don't think that that's necessary. I don't think you need a canned intro and what's up you guys, but that's just me. I try not to say we or better. I don't like the royal we. I don't like saying better or best. I actually covered this in a YouTube short a long time ago. But having these rules can be a curse. I have another YouTube playlist. Actually, this one's not on YouTube. It's just on my phone. It's called Is. I don't know how secretly or quietly people have just started saying is. For example, the thing is the problem is, and it's driving me crazy. And so it's a curse that I don't wish upon anybody else. I used to work for a Nobel Prize winning scientist, and he taught me the difference between number and amount, i.e. the number of dollars you have or the amount of money you have. And sometimes, most of the time, I wish I didn't have that knowledge because it's a curse, because I'm always being set off and triggered when somebody uses those words incorrectly. Just so you know, it can be a curse. Keep in mind, by the way, if you're doing this on YouTube, if you're taking certain actions, try to be honest with yourself about certain things that you're saying or doing that are just for you, and certain things that you're saying or doing that are for the benefit of the learner or the viewer. So for example, if you say, oh, and by the way, guys, I really want to hit 100,000 subscribers. So please, before we move on, click the subscribe button. Yes, that is very effective. Just be honest with yourself about that being something that you're doing for yourself. And there's a more generous way to do that, which is something like, okay, guys, I know that this is a very controversial topic, so if there's anything I missed or messed up or glossed over, please leave a comment. I'll do my best to earnestly engage with you in the comments. That is garnering a lot of viewer interaction, but it's a little bit more generous, and I think that that's something to be aware of as you work. Try to keep in mind, and maybe this is just wishful thinking, that the algorithm is meant to seek out content of value. And I think that most of these hustle heads, they try to quantify how the algorithm works, and so you end up doing things that are just chasing after this search tool that's trying to find media of value. So as long as you can try to see this as less scientific and more of an art form, I think you'll be in a good place. This is the last portion of my notes here, and it says technical tips, and I'm not excited to talk about it because I know I've become quite a bit of a nerd about technical tips and I don't want to overload you. So in the event that this becomes a series or something, maybe I'll go deeper into some of these. But general technical tips. Number 1, get a microphone. A microphone will do worlds of good for your media, more than a new lens, a new camera. If you're just using your iPhone's built-in camera or DSLR or webcam's built-in camera, it's going to sound bad, and sound matters 10 times more than video. So you can buy a $15 lapel microphone on Amazon. That will be better than not having one, and that will matter more importantly. I cannot overstate how important audio is, and having better audio than the default that you're given. One common misconception is that you can buy a shotgun microphone and it's going to work sort of like a telescope for sound. It's not like that. It doesn't amplify things just because it's pointed at it. Think of a shotgun microphone as more of just blocking the things that it's not pointing at. So just because you buy a shotgun microphone, you can't mount it to the camera and then stand 50 feet away from it. You really should have the microphone as close as possible to your mouth. And so lapel mic is going to be clipped right here. This handheld mic I'm going to be holding right next to my mouth. And if I was using a shotgun mic or an external microphone that I don't want to be shown, I'm going to hang it right here, right out of view, so that it's as close to my mouth as possible. The same goes for lights. You want the lights to be as close to yourself as possible. There's obviously exceptions if you want hard light and you want to get artistic with it, but I think for the most part, beginners want soft, even light, and so you want to get them as close as possible. I am touching my light source right now with my hand. It is very close. It is just barely out of frame. And so to get soft lighting, this is where it gets nerdy, because you really want the biggest possible light source. So that's why if you take a lot of selfies, if you stand right next to or right in front of a big window, the window is a huge light source, like at least 3 feet wide. The window in this room is very big, probably 6 feet wide. So understand that that light source is very big, and it gets bigger the closer you get to it, right? Because you'll say, well, the sun is the biggest light source we've got. And if I go stand outside at noon, the light looks horrible. The size of the light is really a function of its actual mass, but also of how close it is to you. So in the case of these lights that are very close to me, I've gotten them very close to me to increase their effective size. And I think one of the reasons why it's so difficult to talk about this sort of stuff is because once you become an expert in the field, you start to use things like the inverse square law to explain the physicality of light. That doesn't do anybody any good if they're just trying to learn how to light a frame. And so get the biggest lights you possibly can. If that means buying a really expensive softbox and putting it as close as possible to you, great if you can afford it. Otherwise, go stand next to a big window, and that works as a very big light source, although it's not exactly available on demand. One technical tip that's just for me, minimize jump cuts. I'm sure there's going to be a ton of jump cuts in this video because it's not very scripted. I'm just reading notes off of my phone, but whenever you can, try to minimize jump cuts by covering it with B-roll or practicing and reading your teleprompter. By the way, buy a teleprompter. Teleprompters used to be these really complicated screens with mirrors. These days, you can just slide your iPhone into a little sandwich of mirrors and mount that to your lens so you can just look right at the camera and read. You don't have to memorize anything. It makes everything so much easier. When it comes to cameras and lenses, I wouldn't wish the task of buying a new camera on my greatest enemies. Buying cameras is a very difficult task, and when you figure it out, when you feel like you figured out what camera you want, some other one pops up and it's like, well, this one has better low light performance. So my tip to you there is that you have to be honest about what you actually need. Otherwise, you're going to say, maybe I should get the one with better low light performance, even though you're never going to use it in a low light scenario. Also, try to keep in mind that the function of a camera is to give you more capabilities and more features, like shooting in slow-mo, shooting in 4K. Buying a new lens is to improve the actual picture quality. The glass is going to be nicer, maybe it autofocuses better. So keep in mind that the lens is for better image quality and the camera is for what your actual camera can capture and what it can do. I think a lot of times people think, well, the way that I make my picture look better is by buying a new camera. That's usually not the case, and buying a nicer lens is going to get you there more quickly, provided that you don't need to add 60 FPS capability to your camera as well. And the last note here is definitely going to get pretty hairy. I think for the most part, all beginners and maybe even intermediates should just be using the full auto capabilities on their camera. There are certain cases where you need to do manual focus. For example, if you know you're going to be stirring a pot, I know my hand is going to come into the frame and start stirring, and I don't want it to autofocus on my hand as it stirs, so I'll set it to manual focus, nail it onto the pan or the pot, and start stirring with the manual focus turned on. The same for auto white balance. In this case, I don't want it auto white balance because I want the color of this green behind me to stay exactly the same green, so it's easier to key out. Do I even want to get into this? If you want to stop shooting on full auto, you have to understand the exposure triangle, and there are 3 things that contribute to a well-exposed video or photo, and that is your shutter speed, your ISO, and your aperture. So if you're shooting a video, you can just double your FPS to get your shutter speed. So if you're shooting this video at 24 frames per second, you would roughly double that and set your shutter speed to 1/50. So that's 1 out of the 3 decisions made for you. The second is the only real decision that you have to make as an artist, and that is how much of the frame do you want to be in focus versus that nice blurry background. And way too often, people, especially in the instructional field, blur out way too much. If I'm showing you a plate of chicken strips, I don't want just the first chicken strip to be in focus while all the other ones are blurry. I understand that having a blurry background looks cool, but there are certain times, like with product photography, that you want it to all be in focus. And if you get this wrong, you might have your nose in focus because it's the thing that's closest and most centered to the lens, and your depth of field is so shallow that your eyes are out of focus, and that's not good. So that's really the only choice that you have to make. And then the last part of that exposure triangle is ISO, and you would just dial that up or down to get a properly exposed image so that the brightest parts are not too bright and the darkest parts are not too dark. So you have a dial on your camera with a bunch of different options, and that's if you want to ease yourself into shooting in full manual. You don't really have to jump in all at once. You can set that dial to A or AV for aperture priority, meaning prioritize the aperture. That's the one part that you're going to decide on how much is in focus, and use the internal computer of the camera to put everything else on auto. So if you want to take a portrait of somebody, I might put the aperture at f1.8 so that it's really nice and blurry and dreamy, and then let the camera just decide, put everything else on full auto. The same for the S on the dial for shutter speed priority. If I'm photographing things or people that are moving very fast, I want to just prioritize the shutter speed so that it's opening and closing really quickly, so I get a nice crisp image, not all blurry. And then I let the computer inside of the camera decide everything else and put all of that on auto. And I think that's all I'm going to talk about regarding cameras. The last technical tip that I have for you here is to read books. For example, Samin Nosrat's Salt, Fat, Acid, Heat, however you say that. I knew most of the information in that book already regarding the cooking material, but I listen to audiobooks, hearing the author introduce these complicated topics and untangle them and put it all in a narrative format is really helpful to my own instructional design skills. Another one is Why Buddhism is True. This guy does some really serious grammatical acrobatics to filter a global religion through a secular scientific lens and communicate it to a lay audience with an emphasis on reducing suffering. But really, any book that you read is going to let you hear how people communicate information, especially because social media is doing so much harm in terms of superfluous wording. POV. Why is it that so many memes right now have POV at the beginning, even though they're not showing the point of view of what they state to be showing? The same for starter pack. I saw something that was like, it was a meme of villains who got destroyed by their enemies starter pack was the caption on this meme. And it shows the Green Goblin and Voldemort and Andrew Tate because of this whole Greta Thunberg drama going on right now. But anyway, you don't need the word starter pack in there. You can just say villains who were destroyed by their teenage enemies. Social media is doing a very bad job at getting you to learn how to communicate information in a very concise and digestible and straightforward way, because so much of it revolves around, I guess, tribalism or cultural inclusion, and making you feel as though if you talk in this way, more people will relate to you. And that presents itself in the mimetic editing styles of certain YouTube videos, or using certain language like, ooh, this croissant is looking mighty sussy baka. You know what I'm talking about. And since I've said sussy baka, we've come to an end. Really, the last tip that I can give you is to get started immediately. Understand that your first works are going to be very bad. I don't even want you to go back and look at my first works, because they were out of focus, the sound was bad, the script writing was all over the place, my tone was not dialed in. And even when you do get started, and when you do get to a point where you feel like you've figured out a formula, sometimes, like in the case of this video, you have something else to talk about, and you don't know how to slot that into your current format. I will say the hardest video that I ever wrote or performed was my second April Fool's Day video, because the first one established, oh, this is a funny joke, and the second one is establishing in which direction does this joke go? Is it going to be still lampooning the same style of creator? Is it going to be still in the realm of food? What are we talking about here? I guess one example, one video makes a point, but two videos makes a line. And that's why it's really difficult to start a second channel, because it's like, where does that line point? What is it that you're talking about? What is the common thread between these 2 points that connects it as a line? And you're not going to figure any of that stuff out until you really get out there. You really start finding out with practice what you do and don't like about the process, what you can streamline, what you can outsource. So make a resolution that you're going to make a video a week for 4 weeks, or that you're going to present something to your boss and just say, Internet Shaquille gave me permission to post this. I understand it's not at its full capacity. Consider it a proof of concept. And I hope that I see more people out there trying to make a difference in the world, making work that matters for people who care, starting now. Thank you for watching.